When people hear about haunted orphanages, it often feels like a tale spun for late-night ghost stories, something to share for the thrill of it. But Durnham Orphanage wasn't just a story for me, it became a chilling chapter in my life, one I'll never forget. Durnham Orphanage sat abandoned on the outskirts of my hometown, surrounded by an overgrown field and a dense line of oak trees. Its towering Gothic architecture had long become a magnet for urban explorers and thrill-seekers. Stories about children's laughter echoing through the halls, shadowy figures in the windows, and ghostly whispers filled our local legends. I wasn't much for ghost stories. I believed in logic, science, and reason. That was until my best friend, Alex, convinced me to explore Durnham one chilly autumn night. "Let's prove everyone wrong," he had said, a mischievous grin spreading across his face. "Besides, what's the worst that can happen?" We arrived at the orphanage just as the sun dipped below the horizon, casting the building in a sinister glow. Its broken windows stared down at us like hollow eyes, and the crumbling facade seemed to breathe with the wind. Alex was the adventurous one, but even he hesitated at the gate. "Ready?" he asked, his voice barely masking his nervousness. I nodded, more out of pride than confidence, and we stepped inside. The air felt heavy, like the weight of 1,000 stories pressing down on us. The foyer was littered with debris, broken furniture, shattered glass, and graffiti covering the once beautiful walls. We walked through the orphanage, our flashlights casting long, eerie shadows on the walls. The stories had painted Durnham as a place of unimaginable tragedy. It was said that a fire had taken the lives of several children decades ago, and their spirits never left. As we ventured deeper into the orphanage, the air grew colder. I remember the exact moment the atmosphere shifted. We were in what used to be the dining hall, its long tables and benches now rotting piles of wood. Alex was ahead of me, shining his flashlight on an old painting of a woman who must have been a caretaker. That's when I heard it. A faint giggle. I froze, my heart pounding in my chest. "Did you hear that?" I whispered. Alex turned, his brow furrowed. "Hear what?" The giggle came again, louder this time, and it sent shivers down my spine. Alex's eyes widened, and for the first time I saw real fear in his face. "Okay, that's creepy," he admitted. We both stood still, listening. The sound of small pattering footsteps echoed down the hall, as though a child were running, but there was no one there. We decided to leave, but as we retraced our steps, Alex stopped abruptly in front of a door that hadn't been there before. It was old, wooden, and slightly ajar, with the faint sound of whispers coming from within. "Did we miss this?" Alex asked, his voice trembling. I shook my head. I was sure that door wasn't there earlier. Against my better judgment, Alex pushed it open, and we stepped inside. The room was small, with peeling wallpaper and a single wooden chair in the center. On the floor was a dusty old toy train, its bright colors faded with time. Alex picked it up, examining it. "Looks like someone left this here," he said, but his voice sounded distant. As he held the train, the whispers grew louder, filling the room. They weren't clear, just fragmented voices overlapping in a haunting symphony. Then the train moved. Alex dropped it instantly, and it clattered to the floor, rolling to a stop at my feet. "Let's go," I said, grabbing his arm. But before we could leave, the door slammed shut with a deafening bang, and the whispers stopped. We were trapped. Alex banged on the door, shouting, but it wouldn't budge. The air in the room grew icy, and my breath fogged in front of me. That's when I saw it. In the corner of the room, a shadow began to form. It was darker than anything I'd ever seen, its shape twisting and growing until it resembled a figure, tall and menacing. Two glowing eyes stared at us from the void. I couldn't move. I couldn't speak. The shadow raised a hand, and the toy train began to move on its own, circling the room as if mocking us. "Who are you?" Alex shouted, his voice breaking. The shadow didn't respond. Instead, it moved closer, the air around it vibrating with an unnatural hum. The whispers returned, but this time they were louder, clearer. They were saying one word, over and over. "Leave." In a burst of courage, or sheer panic, Alex grabbed the train and threw it at the shadow. The moment it hit, the shadow let out a bone-chilling scream, and the room was plunged into darkness. The door flew open, and we didn't hesitate. We ran, our flashlights bobbing wildly as we made our way out of the orphanage. Behind us, we could hear the sound of footsteps chasing us, but when we reached the gate and turned back, no one was there. That night, Alex and I swore never to return to Durnham Orphanage. But the story didn't end there. I thought we'd left the horrors of Durnham Orphanage behind when we ran through its rusted gates that night. I thought we'd be safe as long as we didn't return. But I was wrong. The shadow, the whispers, the icy presence, they had followed us. In the days after our terrifying encounter, Alex and I tried to rationalize what had happened. "It was just our imagination," he said one evening, his voice shaky. "Maybe gas leaks or something in the air made us hallucinate." I wanted to believe him, but deep down, I knew the truth. The first sign that something wasn't right came 3 nights later. I woke up around 3 a.m. to the sound of faint knocking. It was rhythmic, deliberate, and it seemed to be coming from inside my bedroom. My heart raced as I turned on the light, scanning the room. Nothing. I convinced myself it was just the house settling, but when I lay back down, the knocking started again, this time louder. Then I felt it, the same icy presence I'd felt in that locked room. I couldn't see it, but I knew it was there, watching me. I barely slept that night, and when morning finally came, I called Alex. "It's here," I said, my voice trembling. He didn't even ask what I meant. "It's happening to me too," he admitted. Alex described how his lights had flickered the night before, and how he'd seen a dark figure standing at the foot of his bed. When he turned on the light, it was gone, but the feeling of being watched lingered. A week passed, and things only got worse. One evening, as I was sitting in my living room trying to distract myself with TV, I heard a familiar sound. It was faint at first, like the distant clatter of wheels on wood. I froze. The sound grew louder, and when I looked toward the hallway, my blood ran cold. The toy train from Durnham Orphanage was rolling slowly toward me, its faded paint and broken wheels unmistakable. "How?" I whispered, my voice barely audible. The train stopped at my feet, and for a moment everything was silent. Then the whispers began. They were faint at first, but they grew louder, overlapping into a cacophony of voices. I ran. I didn't stop until I reached Alex's house. When I told him what had happened, he didn't look surprised. "It's trying to scare us," he said. "But why?" Desperate for answers, we decided to do some research about Durnham Orphanage. We spent hours digging through old newspapers, library archives, and online forums. What we found was worse than we could have imagined. Durnham Orphanage had a dark history. In the 1950s, it was run by a woman named Margaret Greaves, a strict and cruel matron who was rumored to have practiced occult rituals. Several children had died under mysterious circumstances, and whispers of abuse and neglect surrounded her legacy. One article mentioned a fire that had consumed part of the orphanage, killing Margaret and several children. But there was something strange about the accounts. Survivors claimed that the fire wasn't natural, that it had started in the locked room where Margaret conducted her rituals. Alex and I exchanged uneasy glances. "What if Margaret's spirit is still there?" he asked. "What if she's the shadow?" That night, we decided to stay together at Alex's house. We were too afraid to be alone, and we figured there was safety in numbers. But the shadow didn't care. Around midnight, the temperature in the room dropped suddenly, and the lights flickered. Alex and I stared at each other, frozen in fear. Then the whispers started, louder than ever. "Why did you disturb me?" The voice was deep, guttural, and filled with anger. It seemed to echo from everywhere at once. The shadows in the room began to move, pooling in the corners before taking shape. Margaret? Her figure loomed before us, her eyes glowing with an unnatural light. She raised a hand, and the toy train appeared at her feet, rolling slowly toward us. "You don't belong here," she said, her voice like 1,000 whispers. "Leave or join them." The next day, we sought help. We found a local priest, Father Ramirez, who had experience dealing with hauntings. When we told him about our experience, he nodded gravely. Durnham Orphanage is cursed, he said. Margaret's soul is trapped there, along with the spirits of the children. She won't rest until she's avenged. Father Ramirez agreed to cleanse our homes and the orphanage. That evening, we returned to Durnham with him, armed with holy water, prayer books, and a burning determination to end this nightmare. The orphanage was even more foreboding at night, but we pressed on. Inside, the air was thick with the same oppressive energy we'd felt before. Father Ramirez began his prayers, sprinkling holy water and chanting in Latin. The shadows writhed in anger, and Margaret appeared again, her form more terrifying than ever. She screamed, a sound that shook the very walls of the orphanage. The whispers of the children grew louder, pleading and crying. "Set us free," one voice said. With a final prayer, Father Ramirez threw holy water at Margaret's figure. She let out a bone-chilling scream and dissolved into the shadows. The air grew still, and the whispers faded. The haunting stopped after that night. The oppressive presence was gone, and the toy train never appeared again. Alex and I tried to move on with our lives, but we were forever changed by what we'd experienced. Durnham Orphanage was eventually torn down, its dark history buried with the rubble. But sometimes, late at night, I still hear faint whispers, and I wonder, did we really set them free? Or did we just make things worse? After Father Ramirez's cleansing ritual, I had hoped we'd seen the last of Margaret Greaves and the horrors of Durnham Orphanage. But as the days turned into weeks, I began to realize that what we thought was the end was only the beginning. For a few weeks, life felt almost normal again. Alex and I stopped waking up to the whispers or seeing the shadowy figure lurking in the corners of our rooms. The air in our homes felt lighter, and we dared to believe that Father Ramirez's prayers had worked. Then, on a cold, rainy night, the whispers came back. I woke up to the familiar sensation of being watched. The room was icy cold, and the hair on the back of my neck stood on end. At first, I thought it was just my paranoia playing tricks on me. But then, I heard it, a faint guttural voice murmuring my name. "Come back." I froze, my heart pounding in my chest. The voice wasn't coming from inside my head. It was coming from the corner of the room. When I turned, I saw her, Margaret Greaves. Her shadowy figure was more defined than ever, her glowing eyes burning with malevolence. She didn't say anything else, but her presence was enough to fill me with dread. I ran out of my house without looking back and drove straight to Alex's place. Alex opened the door, his face pale and drawn. "It's happening again, isn't it?" he asked. I nodded, too shaken to speak. Alex let me in, and we sat in his living room, trying to come up with a plan. It was clear that the cleansing ritual hadn't been enough to banish Margaret. But why? Had we missed something? That's when Alex pulled out a journal he'd found during our research. It belonged to one of the children who had lived at Durnham Orphanage. The entries were heartbreaking, detailing the abuse they'd suffered under Margaret's care. But one passage stood out. Ms. Greaves said we had to protect her secret. She made us swear we wouldn't tell. If we broke the promise, she said we'd be cursed forever. Alex and I exchanged a worried glance. "What if there's something we missed in the orphanage?" I asked. "Something tying her spirit to that place?" Reluctantly, we decided to go back to Durnham Orphanage one last time. Father Ramirez agreed to join us again, though he seemed uneasy. "If her spirit has returned, it means there's unfinished business," he said. "We must uncover the truth." We arrived at the orphanage late at night. The building was even more foreboding than I remembered, its broken windows like empty, soulless eyes. As we stepped inside, the oppressive energy hit us like a wave. The whispers started almost immediately, faint but unmistakable. "Help us!" "She won't let us go." The voices of the children echoed through the halls, growing louder as we made our way to the room where Margaret had performed her rituals. The locked room looked the same as before, but something felt different. The air was heavier, the shadows darker. Father Ramirez began his prayers, but this time they didn't seem to have any effect. Then Alex noticed something. One of the floorboards near the altar was loose. With trembling hands he pried it up, revealing a small, hidden compartment. Inside was a collection of objects, an old locket, a child's doll, and a leather-bound book. The book was filled with dark rituals and incantations, written in Margaret's handwriting. But it was the locket that caught my attention. When I opened it, I found a photograph of Margaret with a little boy. On the back of the photo, the words, "My son Henry," were scrawled in faded ink. "She had a child?" Alex asked, incredulous. Father Ramirez nodded gravely. "This explains everything. Her spirit is bound here because of her guilt and her connection to this place. We need to destroy these items to sever her ties to the orphanage." As soon as we removed the items from the compartment, the room erupted into chaos. The whispers turned into screams, and the shadows coalesced into Margaret's terrifying figure. "You will not take him from me," she bellowed, her voice shaking the walls. The temperature in the room plummeted, and the candles on the altar burst into flames. Margaret's figure grew larger, more menacing as she advanced toward us. Father Ramirez began reciting prayers louder, holding up a crucifix. "You have no power here, Margaret Greaves. You must release these children and move on." Margaret screamed in defiance, but when Alex threw the locket into the flames, her figure faltered. The shadows around her began to dissolve, and the screams of the children turned into cries of relief. One by one, the spirits of the children appeared, their faces no longer twisted in fear. They smiled at us, their forms glowing with a soft light. "Thank you," one of them whispered before fading away. When the flames died out, Margaret was gone, and the oppressive energy that had plagued the orphanage vanished. The building felt lighter, almost peaceful, as though a great weight had been lifted. Father Ramirez blessed the orphanage one final time before we left, ensuring that no remnants of Margaret's dark energy remained. In the weeks that followed, Alex and I felt a sense of closure. The whispers stopped, and the nightmares faded. We knew we'd done the right thing, even if it had been terrifying. Durnham Orphanage was eventually demolished, and a park was built in its place, a place filled with laughter and life, where children could play without fear. But sometimes, late at night, I still think about the orphanage and the secrets it held. I wonder if Margaret ever truly found peace, or if some part of her still lingers in the shadows, waiting for someone foolish enough to disturb her rest. Thank you for joining me on this terrifying journey. If you enjoyed this story, don't forget to like, comment, and share. Stay tuned for more spine-chilling tales of the paranormal.